According to McKinsey, the amount of cross-border bandwidth that is used has grown 45 times larger since 2005. It is projected to increase by an additional 9 times over the next 5 years as flows of information, searches, communication, video transactions, and intracompany traffic continues to surge. This growth, however, could pose increased cybersecurity risks for Africa. My guests for this conversation today are Chidinma Iwe, the Chief Information Security Officer at MainOne, Olufemi Fadairo, Head Information Security System Security at the Nigeria Interbank Settlement System, and Ezekiel Egboye, Director of Operations at the RAC Center. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Chidinma, I want to start with you. Obviously, MainOne is helping to improve the penetration of broadband, data, etc. in the country. Would you say that there is a close link between that increase in penetration and cybercrime?
I would say yes, there is a close link between penetration and cybercrime. We can't stop the penetration from increasing. It will continually increase. There's growth in demand for information in Africa. There's also regulatory impact as well, where regulators are beginning to insist in Nigeria and also all across Africa that data for Africa should come back to Africa.
Right.
With these initiatives, one would expect that some of the challenges you have in other Western worlds in terms of information security, we would begin to experience some of the challenges right here in Africa and Nigeria.
So I think you make a very interesting point. Africa, speaking about Nigeria specifically, is really getting into that information and data age, if you like, and the world has changed tremendously. I want to get your perspective on this, Ezekiel. Your company obviously helps provide data storage service. As that business continues to grow, can you just speak to the increasing threat of cybercrime?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at it, I think we have to look at it from a broader context, not just Nigeria. We've got to look at it from Africa.
Yeah.
Because currently, the cyber world is borderless. It cuts across the borders. So with that, you've got to look at how cybercrime is affecting Africa, looking at policies, looking at what the various governments are doing in order to aid the fight against cybercrime. Now, we've got to take it down a little bit further. You have to look at the application layer, security that needs to be in place. You have to look at the network layer that needs to be in place. And also, because all this infrastructure are all located and stored in the data center.
Right.
So from a data center perspective, the way we look at it from RAC Center is from the physical security aspects. Because cybersecurity is not just from the cyber, they're also the human intervention and human crime in terms of committing security breaches.
Right.
So within RAC Center, we've clearly put 10 levels of physical securities that you have to go through before you can actually get to the physical infrastructure that we have in the facility.
But is that typically enough? I mean, in these days, people find ways to hack, right?
Well, I mean, it's a continuous process. So you can never say it's enough. We constantly review our security policies. We currently work very closely with our group security. That gives us very good insights. We follow industry standards. That's one of my key responsibilities, to constantly follow industry standards and make sure that we're compliant to best practices in terms of security as well.
Right. We'll talk about standards definitely later on the show. But Femi, I want to hear from you. Your company obviously is managing a ton of financial information. You're making financial payments. You're enabling that process in Nigeria. Can you just give us your perspective on cybercrime and the progress we're making to tackle that?
Well, cybercrime, like he has spoken about the fact that data is becoming ubiquitous. It's what everybody's moving towards cyber, doing things on the internet and all of that. It's also making the crime move towards that area. I mean, if we all remember Willie Soten, the armed robber in the US, when he was asked, why do you keep robbing banks? He said, because that's where the money is. And now that the money is moving towards electronic transactions, you see the crime is also moving towards that way. Symantec reports that in 2015, South Africa lost $537 million to cybercrime. Nigeria lost $200 million, and Kenya lost $147 million. I mean, these are mind-numbing figures. These are figures that you begin to ask yourself, how did this happen? in Nigeria, to be specific, looking at financial loss in terms of fraud to cybercrime, we lost 2.2 billion naira. The $200 million is about not just the money that was lost, but the time that was lost in putting things together, getting this infrastructure, man hours and all of that. But in terms of financial detail itself, on the electronic front, we lost 2.2 billion, and that is a huge sum of money. So the truth of the matter is that as we move on to electronic transactions, Africa has to put together some form of way to ensure that we secure our cyberspace.
It is definitely a problem. But earlier he mentioned standards, and I just want to get your perspective on that. I guess that is where we begin to deal with this, putting the right infrastructure in place with respect to legal infrastructure and operational procedures, etc. How are we doing in that respect? I imagine you can talk very closely around what's happening in Nigeria, but what's your thoughts?
Well, I think Nigeria has done a lot. Nigeria is doing a lot. But one of the things we need to be careful about is when we look at the trend, and sometimes what you have is the flow of information sometimes could be much faster than the measures and the security measures that we're actually putting in place. You also have the challenge.
That's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's something to pay
attention.
It may
be growing even quicker than
we're actually responding to.
Regulators are responding.
Yes, so I'm speaking generally now as Nigeria and as Africa, right? We may be responding much slower. And this is not just to look at security institutions, data centers, networking organizations, but look at it from a much broader perspective. So there's a big challenge, and sometimes the challenge is even with the individuals that are saddled with responsibility of taking charge of information security. Information awareness is a very key factor, because sometimes we're putting technology on top of technology on top of technology, and sometimes the challenge isn't just so much about the technology, because look at the developed and industrialized world. We're also having mind-blowing numbers in terms of breaks and hacks as well. So we need to look at that factor as well. Are we ensuring that our people are aware of the threats, are aware of the vulnerabilities within their systems, are aware of the risks associated with securing information, are aware of the value of the assets that we're supposed to protect as well? Right. Because sometimes when you don't understand the value of the asset you're supposed to protect, when there's a loss, then you begin to hear about these numbers, and there's this shock all over the place.
I think you make an interesting point about the value of what we're trying to protect, and you probably understand this very much, Ezekiel, because your company essentially helps people to store their data. Can you just speak to this point?
I always like to look at it from more of an African perspective. The primary reason why I do that is that it's not just synonymous to Nigeria, okay? And we have to have an African policy for us to be able to combat cybercrime. You find that with the industrial world, they have policies, compliance, regulatory procedures that a lot of the businesses and the government follow. But in Africa, you find that if you look at research, recent research clearly tells us that South Africa is the third largest threat after Russia and China that's been hit. And also, Nigeria is becoming one of the major countries that cyber criminals are targeting in Africa.
These criminals are actually coming from outside the countries. I think that's a very important point you're making.
They are, but also they're within the region. They could be within the region because of the weak networks within African countries, and also the lack of awareness and the leadership contribution from Africa. That's causing a huge risk in terms of having access for cyber crimes to penetrate. So from a RAC Center perspective, what we always try to do is work very closely with our partners for them to very well understand the threats, the risk to their data, and also to their corporate image as well. And for us, branding is very important, not just from a business perspective, but also from a country's perspective. Because if you look at countries that have high rate of crime, tend to have poor economic investments coming there.
Right.
One of the key things to look at is cyber espionage. When you look at the things that are happening within Africa, you find out that in recent times, technology has been aiding cyber terrorism. If you look at the incident that happened in Kenya, the Westgate Mall, we lost over 67 people and millions of dollars of revenue of infrastructure. And also that impacted the flow of tourism, which is a key component within the Kenya industry. So it's a broader picture that we have to look at, and that's the way RAC Center looks at it, and working very closely with partners to make sure that both from a branding perspective and also from your data breaches, data vulnerability, all those issues are being addressed and constantly being monitored as well.
No, we certainly have to look at it from an African perspective, because like you did mention, it is a growing threat across the region, and especially South Africa. I think the point you made is very important. But I want to hear your thoughts on this, Femi, because he picked on something which I think is very important, that the threat is not just coming from within those countries, but from outside those countries. Can you just tell us what you're seeing at NIPS?
Okay, so I can tell you for a fact that every day on the average, we have about 300 attempted attacks on the financial, on NIPS as a central on the financial industry. And we are looking at them and we are seeing all of these threats, all of these attempts coming from China, coming from Russia and all of that. But going back to Africa as a whole, Nigeria today now is the greatest source of cybercrime attacks coming out of Africa, and it's also the greatest...
So, sorry, when you say greatest source, I think those attacks are originating from Nigeria.
Very true.
Right.
And it is also the greatest target of attacks coming into Africa. So Nigeria is pivotal.
Right.
Today, 2015, the population of Africa was said to be 1.1 billion. Nigeria is 180 million people. That's roughly 20% of the whole of Africa. It means in every 5 African, you'll see a Nigerian. And that also translates to the usage of data. And so with the usage of data, like we had earlier said, we are expecting, we are seeing high increase in crime, attacks and attempts on infrastructure. But be that as it may, I'd like to say that in Nigeria we have done quite a lot in terms of policies, especially in the financial sector. You'll see that the CBN has churned out lots of regulations that has made the financial sector, I dare say, in the Nigerian context, the most secured in terms of information security.
We'll come back to that point. We have to take a commercial break right now. I've been speaking to Chidinma Iwe, Chief Information Security Officer at MainOne, Olufemi Fadairo, Head Information Securities at the Nigeria Interbank Settlement System, and Ezekiel Egboye, Director of Operations at the RAC Center. We'll continue our conversation around cybercrime and its challenges in Africa. So we continue our focus on the challenges of cybersecurity in Africa. My guests are Chidinma Iwe, Chief Information Security Officer at MainOne, Olufemi Fadairo, Head Information System Security at the Nigeria Interbank Settlement System, and Ezekiel Egboye, Director of Operations at the RAC Center. Femi, I'm sorry to interrupt you just before the break, but can you just continue with the point you were making about the poll?
So I was trying to tell you that because of the standards and policies around the financial industry, at least within Nigeria, so we have security incidents. A survey was done and 54% of the banks in Nigeria said they've had some security incidents. 77% of that 54% say the security incident was malicious. But guess what? 0% had an external network intrusion.
So it's usually internal.
So that tells you that the policies, the standards, they are really shielding at least from outside. And then we are left with the internal issues. And you know that an issue with, it's the issue of awareness or an internal collaborator that then becomes an issue. But what I'm saying is, in terms of policies, standards, I think Nigeria is doing well. But for the African sub-community, we need to do better. As a matter of fact, the African Union Commission and Economic Commission of Africa, United Nations Economic Commission of Africa, actually are championing a legal framework for the region, for the African region. They actually made a presentation to the Ordinary Office Commission that is in charge of ICT of the United Nations in Khartoum of September 2012. And in Malabo in 2014, the heads of governments of African unions all adopted that legal framework. Till today, we have not implemented. So we need to do something.
So it's a classic case of beginning to appreciate the problem, but we're not executing quick
Exactly,
enough.
exactly.
So I think maybe it's a good opportunity to try and help people appreciate the urgency. And can you just speak to that point, Ezekiel? Let me come back to you. Why must we make, like you've obviously been championing the cause of an Africa collaborative effort. Yes. Obviously, we're hearing that talks are already happening, but can you just speak to the urgency, the cost of delay?
There's definitely that urgency for African nations to react. Cybersecurity is not an issue for just the private sector or the public sector. There's no country that can fight successfully cyber crimes without the political leadership. So African leaders have to be concerned about these issues. Unfortunately, a lot of the African government don't seem to pay enough attention to this. So you find out that some countries like Nigeria, we have the right policies, we've been able to put together frameworks on how we can deal with this. But a lot of the other African countries don't have those frameworks. They've not implemented the legal requirements. And even a few of them that have actually written those policies are not monitoring those policies. They're not following and implementing the various aspects within those policies that needs to be implemented to eradicate or eliminate those threats that we have in Africa.
If you can speak to this point, Chidinma, it goes beyond the government. I think it also comes to the individual, because the magnitude and the diversity of the threat, I think, really takes us to the applications that people are using, the platforms from the mobile phone to the tablet, to the laptop, etc. Can you just speak to the evolution of these threats as technology continues to improve?
I think it would be important to note that cybersecurity doesn't necessarily have any geographical boundaries. So when we talk about Africa and talk about policies for Africa, we need to be careful that some of the frameworks and the policies we're trying to spew out, there are actually no boundaries. So look at the public internet, for example. What boundaries are you trying to create? So if you, for example, have a policy for Africa, it must be directed at critical assets that have been identified as critical for Africa or critical for a specific nation. Now, coming back to the question on how technology has evolved, these are trends that, Africa, most of the time, were users of some of these changes and some of these trends.
And they tend to come here last.
And they tend to come here. I don't want to say last, but they take a while before they come here.
Okay.
They take a while before they come here, yeah. And when they're here, most times we're more interested in using and deriving value from these technologies, and sometimes we don't question the underlying technologies and question the risks that some of these technologies bring to our environments. Yeah. So, and which is why information awareness is a very key factor. Sometimes it is downplayed because a lot of times like I said, we think that I've put in the right technology, but sometimes it's a lot about the processes we put in place in the environments that we have constitutional control over. Yeah. So yes, politically as a nation, we need to do more. We need to be seen to do more along those lines, because today nations around the world are setting up cyber centers, are looking for ways to protect themselves, looking for ways to even launch attacks at other nations.
Right.
So today, just to corroborate what my colleague here just said, we witness attacks coming from specific nations. Maybe I don't want to call those nations, but we know some of those nations that launch these attacks consistently on Nigerian infrastructure, and sometimes the target is to gain illegal access, gain access to unauthorized information that they don't have, they're not supposed to have access to that information, and these are some of the things that give nations competitive edge over other nations, because they have information that is privileged.
Femi, you just mentioned the fact that the Nigerian financial system appears to be fairly secure. Can you just speak to the risk outside the financial system? What are you hearing in terms of attacks or the threats, the vulnerability of other sectors?
So, for me, majorly, and I've preached it, many times the issue with us is we don't do the basics. We do the very high things, we don't do the basics. The major threat we are going to see going forward is going to be on the mobile platform. So people have phones, all of our transactions, I don't know the last time I went to social media on my laptop. I don't know the last time I did my banking on my laptop. Everybody's is doing it on their mobile.
Or the tablets. Yeah.
Now, take a sample of people's phones. They either don't have any passwords on the phones. The ones who say they have passwords have pattern locks. And I keep telling people, pattern locks, you break the pattern locks like you are eating my easily. Secondly, so the people who have locks, who have passwords, you find that they don't have antiviruses or anti-malwares on their phones. So the threat landscape would go to the users.
So the mobile phone
of
is
mobiles.
a major platform that is exposed. And if it's exposed in Nigeria, definitely it's exposed across Africa.
Because the problem with Africa is the problem of awareness and education. If Nigeria, which is one of the very vibrant nations, is experiencing that huge kind of stuff, I can only imagine what's happening in Burundi, what's happening in Zimbabwe. So the kind of things we are beginning to see is that at corporate level, people are protected to some extent, but at individual level, they are very, very porous. Now, individuals will take their porous devices and go into the corporate environment. And the weakest chain determines how strong you are. So the problem we have at hand, majorly I say to people, is we need to educate our people. And then the second major, most important thing is, look, we are going to have attacks. We cannot wish it away.
They will always come.
They will occur. We do not have the response capabilities. That response capabilities, I mean, you go to other countries, the FBI knocks on your door and says, hello company, we think you have been hacked. Check this server, check this server. I don't see us doing that in Nigeria. Our law enforcement agents are not that equipped. So, as the nation really, we need to, if you go and report a cyber issue, which organization do you even report it to in Nigeria? So these are issues. So there is a preventive part of it, which is people being aware and doing the basic minimum things. And when we do those basic things, it goes a long, long way. It's like when they say you wash your hands after using the bathroom and all of that. They're basic hygienic things, but they go a long way in keeping you healthy.
No, a very interesting point you're making. And maybe you can speak to this whole issue around how law enforcement needs to prepare. Because definitely we're going to have to react. He made a good point that attacks will continue to come. Can you just add to some of the points he made?
In every areas that you have issues, you must have incident management processes in place. Right. So incident management processes are very key in how we respond to incidents when these incidents happen. And I'll just clarify also on what he's just mentioned. Today we're not, I mean, if you ask the average Nigerian on the street, how would he respond to an incident? Where would you report? Where would you report an incident that has happened to you? I'm not aware of it. Maybe there are, but I'm not aware of it. So it's one of the key things that we have to look at within the country. Also, it's important also for us to look at research domains. You find that there are lots of organizations that have been doing researches in terms of cyber crimes and ways to mitigate those risks and prevent those risks. But do we have a central database that every individual or every other researcher can log into and look at existing materials? I'm not aware of it as well. So those key things are things that we've got to start looking into and how to enhance what we're doing in the country and how we can better educate the people as well, and also the various stakeholders that are involved in trying to fix this issue for us.
I think this is a very important point. Chidinma, I don't know if you want to add to this point about awareness and helping people prepare for attacks and so forth.
Yes, maybe, just to dive into, talk about the standards. We talked about standards. There are standard organizations, standard bodies around the areas of security, especially for institutions in Nigeria. So when we look at critical assets, where do most of our critical assets in Nigeria and Africa sit? Most times they sit within the corporates and within the government institutions. So we need to see how do we ensure that our institutions are complying with international standards. Standards like the PCI DSS standards, the ISO 27001 standards around information security. Some of these standards aid organizations to raise their security profile such that a lot of attacks that would have, come to those institutions, those organizations would have been protected. Okay.
Right.
Now, these courses are some of the courses that MainOne, for example, is advancing in Nigeria, looking at its partnership as well with the NSA and with other, security institutions within Nigeria to ensure that we are aware of these standard organizations, of these standards, and we're actually implementing these standards in organizations.
But would you say there's a need for maybe starting from the individual countries and then to the broader region to have an institution that is set to challenge cybercrime, the same way we have things like Interpol for crime in general? Do you think there's enough of a case to begin to prepare for what is coming?
Well, I'm not an advocate for increased institutions in Nigeria, because sometimes
because
challenge
obviously that helps
yeah.
information sharing and so forth.
It does help. I agree with you. Maybe what we should be looking at is what existing institutions do we need to saddle with that additional responsibility, right, as opposed to, what new institution do we then need to create in order to tackle. I don't think FBI's responsibility is exclusively provision of cybersecurity.
I hear you. But Femi, what do you think?
Okay, so I know that for a fact the NSA is saddled with this response. The level at which the NSA can respond today is a different thing.
You want to add a point, but I really have run out of time, so I really apologize for that. We'll continue this conversation another day. Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here. Been speaking to Chidinma Iwe, Chief Information Security Officer at MainOne, Olufemi Fadairo, Head Information System Security at the Nigerian Interbank Settlement System, and Ezekiel Egboye, Director of Operations at the RAC Center. Thank you very much for joining us.